moth of some description been unearthed. Bear with me. Yule, that ancient pagan holiday that at every single Christmas dinner will be brought up by that one family member who is still an edgy internet atheist, despite it being 2023. But why do they bring up these ancient pagan festivities? Well, because like every 15-year-old going through their edgy atheist phase, they have to go on a 40-minute tirade about how the peaceful native indigenous people of Northern and Western Europe had their winter celebration stolen by the most evil religion in the world. No, not that one. But is it true? Did the Christians steal Yule? Turns out that that question creates a fairly long video. Yule. Now, one day, this is the part of the video where I will shill for Raid Shadow Legends, and I'll get paid lots of money for shilling for Raid Shadow Legends. But until then, you can support me by becoming a patron and getting access to these videos 48 hours early. And if you don't fancy becoming a patron, you can support me by simply liking, subscribing, sharing, and tapping on that bell icon to get notified whenever I upload. Why did I use my thumb first when I was counting? Now, last year I did a video on Saturnalia, which, if I don't say so myself, was pretty good. And I highly recommend watching it because it will form the basis of this video. However, if you don't fancy going to watch that first, I'll catch you up quickly. Now, in that video, we look at Saturnalia and its traditions and how they naturally evolved into Christmas rather than the Christians hijacking it. It was basically a case of both holidays existing at the same time for a bit. And the early Christians, who had just superseded paganism in the Roman Empire, basically said, look, we know you're going to drink, we know you're going to feast, we know you're going to have a good old big party. We just ask that you direct that thanks and cheer towards our God instead. Now, if you want to go more in depth with that, I do really recommend my video on Saturnalia. I just covered my face with my hand. That's brilliant shot management there. Anyways, now we've got the basics covered, we'll get on with the rest of the video. Yule has had many names over the years and is incredibly important to various different cultures, particularly the Germanic peoples such as Scandinavians and the Saxons. They saw this time of year as a rebirth. Yes, the Celts did see it like this as well. However, it wasn't called Yule, it was winter. So we'll go over the Celts in this video as well. Do not panic. This video's 20... The script for this video is 26 pages, so chill. We've got a lot to get through. This was the time of year when the sun was at its weakest. However, this also meant that the sun would begin to gain its strength, bringing sunnier and warmer days with it. Of course the sun regaining its strength would bring sunnier days. It's the sun. This would be celebrated under many names by many different cultures. In Old English, it would have been Yule or Gyorhol. It's almost certainly pronounced wrong. Which was a season of hunting that took place after the harvest had finished. These two words could also be the precursor for the modern English word jolly. We don't know for sure. Just a quick heads up, we don't know for sure is gonna come up a lot in this video. Alongside this, the words Yule or Gyola was the name given to a month of the year that was originally between the modern months of December and January. The word Yule is attributed to mean wheel, which links to wheeling points of the year which the sun would travel through, such as the summer and the winter solstice. This may be a possible origin for the word Yule, which is the only word that I probably pronounced correctly so far. Another possible origin for the word Yule is Gyule, which would have become Yule and then eventually Yule. This is now known as Christmastide, or more colloquially, the 12 days of Christmas. In Old Norse it was called Yule or Yule, which may have referred to a feast for the sun, as well as a segment of the name for the Old Norse god Odin, who was the chief god of the Norse pantheon. The Yulefather, or Yule Father, gave him a strong association to the Yule festival, as well as the sun. Odin is sometimes referred to as Yulnir, or the Yule One. This may refer to his part in the Wild Hunt, which we'll discuss in a bit. In fact, Yule or Yule gives us another possible origin for the modern word Yule. In fact, in modern day Scandinavia, Christmas is still referred to as Yule. Yule can also sometimes be used to describe a feast, such as Huggins Yule or Huggins Yule, Hugin being one of Odin's ravens. A modern Yule board, which is a type of Scandinavian Christmas feast, may actually link back to these ancient pagan feasts. Possibly. You're going to hear the words may and possibly a lot as well. That's what happens when all your sources for something come hundreds of years after they happened. As Yule heavily focuses on the sun, you could often find bonfires and other visible light sources being lit as part of the celebrations. That and probably because it was freezing cold in winter back then. It's freezing cold now.
How dare you!
Don't make a global warming joke. Don't make a global warming joke. Yule normally began on the winter solstice, which in the northern hemisphere took place on the 21st and the 22nd of December, and in the southern hemisphere it took place on the 20th and 21st of June, although depending on various cultures and when Yule was being celebrated, it may begin on different days. We'll get to that later. As with many things in history, Yule and its traditions were eventually forgotten and then rediscovered later down the line. In fact, in the 19th century, a lot of these traditions came back to light as people got this obsession with things like the Vikinger and the Egyptians, but then they would eat the mummies. Victorians were weird, man. And as people began combing through these ancient texts and sources, they began noticing similarities between our Christmas traditions and Yule traditions. The Celts celebrated the winter solstice as well, believing that this time of year was when the new sun god was born. Much like the Germanic peoples, they would sing to the new sun god. This would possibly, over time, be one of the possible origins for Christmas caroling, although those would focus more on Christian traditions such as the birth of Christ. There is also a much more obvious origin for Christmas carols that we'll cover in a bit. One of the possible reasons that the Celts celebrated the winter solstice was to actually ensure that the sun returned, because there was a genuine fear that the sun may actually not come back and the cold, harrowing grip of winter would be prolonged. Now, you're going to notice a lot of conflicting information as this video goes on, particularly in the traditions section. This is because, 1. Yule was not a uniform holiday like Saturnalia. It was celebrated differently in various places at various different times. 2. The holiday changed over time. 3. Our main sources were writing about Yule a good few hundred years after Yule had finished being traditionally celebrated. Our first source, the Anglo-Saxon monk St. Bede, was a key figure in the spread of Christianity in the north of England. He also gives us perhaps our earliest mention of Yule. In 725 CE/AD, St. Bede would examine the ancient holidays and traditions of the Celts, as well as the ancient Germanic cultures such as the Anglo-Saxons and various Scandinavian groups. He noted that the Roman months of December and January were merged into a single time period in the old pagan calendar known as Yule. The months of Yule derive their name from the day when the sun turns back and begins to increase. This time period was built around the days now getting longer and the soil once again being able to produce life. It also means that men who drive a Corsa can't pick up their teenage girlfriend under the cover of darkness. The season of Yuletide lasted roughly from the end of November to the beginning weeks of January, and with 3 days of feasting and celebration beginning on the winter solstice. This would mark the beginning of the new year. As part of the celebrations, hairy Scandinavian warriors would drikke Yule, or drink Yule. Now enters our next source for Yule. Snorri Sturluson. Born in 1179, Snorri was a part of Iceland's most powerful families. In fact, by the time of his passing, he was the wealthiest man on the island. Snorri's tale ends sadly as he fell out with another leading Icelandic family. In fact, he was eventually unalived by his son-in-law in a cellar. According to Snorri, Yule began on Midwinter Night, or the 12th of January, and then would be preceded with 3 days of feasting and celebration, with the first night being known as Slaughter Night. On Slaughter Night, animals would be slaughtered. Their blood would then be collected in bowls and then splashed across wooden idols of the gods with a bunch of twigs. There wasn't enough twigs or sticks to make up the thing that has the word that everyone uses an excuse on the internet to say the other word. Really worried how the live chat's going to look when this premieres, or how the comments are going to look when it's finally up. Once the animals had been sacrificed, they would be eaten in a feast called Juleblot. Now, not all sources agree on how long Yule was, and some claim that Yule was a 12-day holiday and is actually where we get the 12 days of Christmas from. However, there is an incredibly high chance that we're just going full circle, and this is Christian traditions being pushed onto an ancient pagan holiday because sources coming after the event. We will come back round to this, however, for purposes of getting information across, this 12-day version of Yule begins directly on the winter solstice. Now, there seems to be a lot of variation on this 12-day version of Yule, and what actually happened on the individual days. However, here is one version of what may have happened on this 12-day version of Yule. The first night of Yule, Mother's Night, or Modernicht, sacred to Frigg, Freya and the Disir, industriousness, Yulmanaf. The second night of Yule, the Wild Hunt, sacred to Odin and ancestors, perseverance, horning. The third night of Yule, sacred to Mani and darkness, courage, lenting. The fourth night of Yule, sacred to Aegir, Njord and Freya, love, Ostara. The fifth night of Yule, sacred to community, hospitality, merry moon. The sixth night of Yule, sacred to ear and healing, discipline mid-year. The seventh night of Yule, sacred to fore and children, fidelity, haymoon. The eighth night of Yule, sacred to Skadi and Ullr, truth, harvest. The ninth night of Yule, sacred to Odin and fathers, honour, shedding. The 10th night of Yule, sacred to Sunna and light, justice, hunting. The 11th night of Yule, sacred to the Valkyries and warriors, self-reliance, fog moon. The 12th night of Yule, Wassail, sacred to all divine friends and oath night, wisdom, snow moon. Now, under King Alfred the Great, Yule did actually last for 12 days, because, you know, the devoutly King Alfred would have no reason to try and Christianise Yule. And the reason I bring this up is because in the Saturnalia video we did, we went over how the length of Saturnalia changed throughout its history, and because Saturnalia was essentially just a precursor to Christmas, it's more likely that this 12-day version of Yule was just Christmas imposing its traditions over Yule, rather than the Christians stealing it from the pagans. Both the Norse and the pagan Anglo-Saxons associated various gods with Yule. Most prevalently was Woden for the Anglo-Saxons and other Germanic groups, and Odin for the Norse and other Scandinavians. Yes, both these gods probably stem from an earlier religion that sort of deviated as different Germanic groups spread throughout Europe. Now, a portion of Yule will be set aside to prepare for the Wild Hunt, which, depending on which Germanic culture you were from, was either led by Woden or Odin. The story of the Wild Hunt varies depending on culture, with the Celtic and Slavic cultures having their own versions of the Wild Hunt, although the main gist of it is that it assembles at least once a year to claim the souls of those who have passed on. And depending on which version you're listening to. It's either helps them on to the next phase of their existence, or bad things. Now, things do get very different as the story progresses, with the Wild Hunt assembling at different points in the year for different cultures, and occasionally for completely different reasons. However, in the interest of time, I'm going to really try to streamline it here, because quite honestly I could do an entire video on the Wild Hunt itself. At this time of year, Odin was honoured in his position as the god of death and transition, as well as his position as the leader of the Wild Hunt, as well as his position as the leader of the gods. Bro was doing Skyrim level questing before it was cool. Now, in the Germanic tradition, as I said earlier, either Woden or Odin would assemble the Wild Hunt in order to grab those who had passed on, but occasionally they would grab members of the living. Members being individual people, not a man's member. The Wild Hunt was led by Lorraine Bobbitt. Oh no. So if you came across Woden or Odin and the rest of the members of the Wild Hunt, your best bet was to lie on the floor and hope that the Wild Hunt passed you by. Similar to folk traditions of how to avoid getting struck by lightning or avoid a nuclear blast, although in that you need to cover your ears and shut your eyes and stuff. Now, the easiest way to avoid the Wild Hunt was to simply be near the nice warm hearth or a campfire. Essentially a very easy message of don't wander off into the forest on the cold, dark winter's night, or there's a solid chance you won't come back. Before the Yuletide, the Germanic cultures would undergo a period of heightened supernatural activity. How this would play out would vary depending on which culture you were in and when you were in it. In some cases, you'd be fighting off the Draugr, yes, like the ones from Skyrim, and you may also be fighting off various other undead that cross your path, as well as the Wild Hunt. This doesn't sound fun. Although the Wild Hunt most likely appeared closer to or on Yule. Probably. Later stories of the Wild Hunt would see Odin and Woden replaced by Satan as its leader. Of course, as we mentioned earlier, sacrificing and feasting was a large part of Yule. However, sacrifices weren't just made to the gods, they were also made to spirits, elves, and other entities that were helped or hindered the Germanic people. Some of the sacrifices would also be made to those who had passed on. A portion of the meal would be left nearby for the gods or various other supernatural entities to eat, and hopefully this offering would secure the safety of the household. In fact, in Scandinavia today it is still tradition to leave out food, normally porridge, for the red-capped tomte or nissi. These are house spirits or house elves similar to the brownie or bruni in English folklore, or the gruagach in Gaelic folklore. Why did I put an R sound on the gruagach? Why did I do it again? It's also easy to see how this developed into leaving out milk and cookies for Father Christmas, who in Sweden is known as Yule Tomte, or the Yule Elf, on Christmas Eve. You'd also leave out a carrot for the reindeer, but the reindeer would also, always leave suspiciously human marks. Anyways, it doesn't make any sense, and Santa deniers will use it as evidence if I talk about it too much, so we'll move on. A wild boar was the centrepiece of many Yule feasts, and this was possibly symbolism for the Wild Hunt, but it was more likely an acknowledgement of the twin brother of the goddess Freya, Freyr. Freyr was the god of prosperity and fertility, and the wild boar represented said fertility. This led to many pigs and many wild boars being sacrificed to the god and then eaten at Yule. In some cases, the boar would be served with an apple in its mouth, and over time this tradition would morph into the Christmas ham, as well as the boar's head Christmas carol. Another reason animals were sacrificed en masse during Yule was probably because as the winter came along, you needed to ration your food, so rather than weaken your entire herd of cattle by sharing out the food equally, you could take out a few cattle, eat them yourself, giving yourself more food, and then have the stronger herd because they're being fed properly, and you haven't got to take away more food from your... It's just a win-win for everyone. Apart from the cattle being sacrificed, but you know... In the saga of Hakon the Good, in the Heimskringla by Snorri Sturluson, we see that Odin is hailed as a bringer of victory, whilst gods like Njord or Njordur and Freyr are seen as bringers of peace and fertility. Other gods represented in Yule were the winter hunters Uller and Skadi, as well as the goddess Not, the goddess of night, which makes sense given the fact that the winter solstice was the longest night. Mani, the god of the moon, Dagr, the god of the day, and Sunna, the goddess of the sun, would also sometimes be represented in the festivities. Now, this does get a bit convoluted, and no one really seemed to agree which gods were a part of Yule, so we're going to refer to what I've been saying so far. Depends in what culture you were in, when you were in that culture, and also, we don't really know. Early on in the celebrations of Yule, people would have lit bonfires as well as having their raging fires in the hearth. It's possible that these bonfires symbolised light fertility and new beginnings. Over time, these bonfires would have evolved into the Yule log. Now, the idea of the Yule log was that it burned for the entirety of Yule. There's some issues with this that we're going to dive into. Now, according to some sources, the Yule log began as an entire tree that would be cut down and one end pushed into the hearth and lit. This would then burn over the entire period of Yule, with the end of the log being cut off and used to start the fire next year. In the Netherlands, it was believed if you put the end of the log under your bed, it would protect you from lightning strikes, and I would make fun of the Dutch here. However, they did once unalive and eat their Prime Minister, which we can all agree is pretty based, although we live in modern times and it would be a real shame if anyone was to repeat such an action. Real shame. This version of the Yule log also plays into the 12 days of Yule idea, as the Yule log was said to burn for 12 days. Now, in my research on this, I came across a content creator called Ocean Keltoy, and he made the very obvious statement that if you have an entire log in your house that is continuously burning, you're probably going to burn down your house, as well as any heat that you do generate from the log, if it doesn't burn down your house, would be straight out the front door, because to fit the log in, you have to have the front door open. And I don't know if you've been in a Northern European country, it's cold in the winter. Very cold. Especially if you're in Norway. Although it is a myth that the Vikinger came over and did Vikinger things, or literally went to Viking, because it was snowing all the time in Norway. No, it wasn't. In the winter, very cold and very snowy. In the summer, not so much. Not so much. Although, we will pretend it's like that so that Hallmark doesn't start trying to film Christmas movies there. The other issue with this is the fact that burning one log over 12 days is incredibly wasteful in a survivalist culture. Why in the middle of winter would you waste firewood? Quite honestly, of all of the traditions, I really don't believe this one, and the biggest issue with that is, as Ocean Keltoy brings up, there's no primary sources that talk about the Yule log being used in this way. We know that the Yule log was probably a thing inside the hearth. But an entire tree carcass? No! The Yule log is also placed on the Anglo-Saxons with the Yule stock. However, I have a very primary source that can attest the Anglo-Saxons living in medieval England would certainly not have a massive tree carcass going through their house, and in some cases leaving the front door open, letting all the heat out. Because as someone who lives in England right now, I don't care if the gates of hell opened up next to me, I'm not opening up a window, let alone my entire front door, for 30 seconds. I'm British, I am pre-designed to complain about the weather, especially when it's cold and rainy. Although, the rain has certainly had our backs throughout history. Isn't that right, Spain? And France, to be fair. To complete the collection of various peoples who allegedly burned a tree carcass in their homes and avoided somehow setting fire to their homes, the Celts apparently had their own version of the Yule log, which they would burn in order to coax the sun into moving again. I mean, it plays into the being scared that the sun wouldn't come back, I suppose, but the same issues arise. Although I didn't find as much information on the Celtic Yule log, so maybe that one is done properly. Now, the Welsh actually do have their own version of the Yule log called the Boncif Nadolig. 100% pronounced incorrectly, I deeply apologise. But this is set aside to be burned specifically on Christmas Eve or over a number of days. To me, this feels how the actual Yule log, if it did exist, would have been burnt. It was a piece of sacred wood that would have been selected and burned during the winter solstice, or Yule. Again, cultures, time, depending, names. But that's just a theory, a history theory. Thanks for watching. No, I'm just kidding. In some cases, people would throw holly on the fire and sing songs to symbolise the hardships they had pushed through in the past year, and hopefully would bring them good fortune in the year to come. Now, some of you, if not most of you, probably know the Yule log in a very different way. Whilst yes, some people who practice Christmas do burn Yule logs, other countries took the Yule log and got a bit different. In the 19th century, the French actually did something good. They invented the bouchée de Noël. Probably pronounced that wrong. Don't care, it's French. We all know it as the Yule log, which is the nice chocolatey dessert that we've all eaten at some point in our lives. Also, to all those French people mad at me for saying that just now, if you could all comment roast beef aggressively, I will feel really bad. The dessert is made with thin sheets of sponge and cake spread with buttercream frosting, which is then rolled into the form of a log. This is then decorated with chocolate frosting to simulate tree bark, as well as some fake holly leaves and meringue mushrooms, because only the French could look at mushrooms on a tree and think, I want to make that into a dessert. Now, the Victorians definitely did burn a Yule log, but this was much smaller than the original Yule log, burning for 12 hours instead of 12 days. Evergreen trees found their way into the homes of those celebrating Yule at some point, although this is probably because they're evergreen. This may have been because of some symbolism of life continuing, because whilst everything else lost its leaves, they would keep their greenery, representing the continuation of life. In Scandinavia, these Yule trees were brought inside to keep spirits called Vetir warm. Another possible reason this became a tradition was to bring the outside in. People would decorate these with runes, statues, and images of the gods in order to ward off evil spirits and invite in good ones. They would also decorate these with strips of cloth, which apparently Germans still do today, because Germans. Seriously, when I was younger, my dad told me this story of a German guy he knew, and he would take colourful bits of ribbon and stuff and put it on each branch one by one, and it would take him ages to get each one done. The Germans were patient. It's not always been a good quality. Bows and garlands would be collected and made by those celebrating Yule and used to decorate their homes, similar to how we do for Christmas today, although our bows and garlands are made by a Chinese boy in a sweatshop. Holly especially was used in the decorations, and in fact, for the Celts, the Druids saw holly as sacred and refused to cut down a holly tree, believing it would bring bad luck. It may have also represented fertility. Ivory was used to decorate as well, being used as a sign of fidelity and loyalty. Mistletoe also held importance, particularly to the Scandinavian cultures. In fact, they would hang it from their doorway in order to ward off evil spirits, such as Jehovah's Witnesses or the TV license people. However, the idea that the Celts universally revered mistletoe as sacred probably wasn't true. Pliny the Elder described the Gallic Druids revering it as sacred and cutting it down with special golden tools and letting it fall onto a cloth before it hit the floor. But that was just in Gaul. It was just sort of pushed on to the rest of the Celts. There's no real evidence that outside of Gaul it was revered as sacred. The reason that this myth spread so far was because 19th century antiquarians assumed Pliny meant that these ceremonies were also done on the British Isles, but Pliny never mentions them being done in the British Isles, meaning that this ceremony was probably just performed by the Gallic Druids and not the Brittonic Druids or the Gaelic Druids. Basically, it most likely didn't happen in the British Isles. Birch is the final tree on this list, symbolising rebirth, as it was the first tree in a forest to regrow after everything else had burned down, and this is very fitting for a holiday that is entirely about rebirth. Birch is also the favoured weapon of the Krampus, a figure from Central Europe that is said to have pagan origins, and again, the Krampus is something that deserves a video all of its own, but to streamline it, he basically travels around with Santa and deals with the naughty children. All these evergreen decorations were a simple reminder to the very cold populace that life would return in the spring, and that the days would stop getting dark at 3:30 in the afternoon. The wreath which we hang outside our front doors, or on the inside of our front doors if you live in Essex and you would like to keep your wreath, did originate from Yule. However, they also originated from Saturnalia. I'm not going to retread in how they're involved with Saturnalia because I covered it in the video last year, and we're already on page 11 of the script. The Scandinavians would make a massive wreath, or a series of smaller ones, called sun wheels. They would then set these alight and roll them down a hill in order to entice the sun to return. This would represent transformation and transition as it burnt out towards the bottom of the hill. However, they would immediately light another one and send it rolling down the hill after the previous one. Now, we don't know for sure if human beings were sacrificed during Yule. You have to remember, most of our sources for pagan practices come from the Romans, who, although for most of their history were themselves pagan, saw themselves as a sort of civilized superiority to these barbarians, and later on the Christians either sought to convert the heathen or were themselves of a converted population, writing hundreds of years after the events. So, to say that there's probably a bit of anti-pagan bias is an understatement. So did they sacrifice people in Yule? Maybe. Although if they did, it is definitely more evidence that we haven't continued all of the Yule traditions. Both the Norse and the Saxons held blots, which were sacrificial ceremonies held throughout the winter in order to honour the gods, spirits, and of course, their ancestors. For the Anglo-Saxons, Yule may have begun on Modranicht, or Mother's Night. According to St. Bede, Modranicht took place on the 24th/25th of December and included events of a promiscuous and slightly degenerate nature. Now, many accused the church of moving the date of the birth of Christ so it lined up better with Yule to make conversions easier. Now, we've already covered why this doesn't make sense in my video on Saturnalia. However, when it comes to Yule, there is almost no evidence that the birth of Christ was moved to convert people who were already celebrating Yule. However, moving the date of Yule to line up with Christmas has a little bit more credibility. Now, to celebrate Modranicht, a boar known as Sonorgotor would be sacrificed to the god Freyr and his twin sister Freya. The appearance of Freyr was the representation of growth and promise in the next year. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the reason that there's some similarities in names is because if you trace the Anglo-Saxons and various Scandinavian groups and various other Germanic groups all back through time, they sort of coalesce into one group with and proto-language and religion that then spread out and did its thing. After it had been sacrificed, the boar would be eaten, but only after the Jarls and all of their warriors had placed their hands on its bristles and performed drunken oaths to do great heroic deeds. Very much the ancient version of, I'm gonna win the X Factor, mate. I will. However, some of these oaths would be serious, focusing on marriage proposals, alliances, and trade deals. The topics during these discussions would also normally overlap, especially between alliances and marriage proposals. The Godi, or the priest/chieftain who is in charge of the Hof or the temple, would wear a large gold ring around his neck and would be a part of many of the celebrations involved in Yule. Now, bear with me, I'm not just bringing that up randomly. You see, in other versions of the story of how these oaths were done, they would instead swear on the ring worn by the Godi, or the priest/chieftain. Which makes more sense to me than placing your hand on a boar does, especially when everyone's going to eat that boar. Also, this would have been done in front of witnesses. Forgot to add that in. We did actually find one of these gold rings on the outskirts of Tissot in Denmark when they were excavating an 11th century chieftain's home. One of the key figures in the Christianisation of Norway and the binding of Yule to Christmas was King Hakon Haraldsson the Good of Norway. Spending a large portion of his life in England during the 10th century CE/AD, when he returned to Norway as its king, he brought with him his new religion, Christianity. Now, he wanted to convert his countrymen, but realised that his jarls and chieftains probably wouldn't be too happy to go along with this newfangled religion. Hakon decided on a compromise. You see, according to the Heimskringla, he just decided to move Yule from Midwinter's Eve to the 25th of December. To line it up with the birth of Christ or Christmas. In order to ensure that everyone would celebrate Yule on this brand new date, Hakon decided to do what all governments do best: enforce their ideas with a law. He made it law that observance of Yule should begin at the same time Christian people observed Christmas, and then everyone was to have a measure of ale, or else pay a fine, and keep holiday as long as the ale lasted. Governments using fines to change people to their way of thinking. I'm glad we left this barbaric medieval practice behind. Anyways, Hakon's law did actually work, and Yule and Christmas began to slowly merge together, with Christmas obviously winning out over time. Even with his new laws, being a Christian would cause issues for the king, however. You see, over the period of Yule, horses would be slaughtered, and according to Snorri Sturluson, the altars were to be reddened all over, and also the walls of the temple outside and inside, and the people also were sprinkled, while the meat was to be cooked for a feast. The sacrifice and cooking of horses shows Odin's links to Yule, as Odin was linked to horses, something we briefly touched on during my video on the Knuckle V. Yes, I'm plugging my videos again. Hakon didn't want anything to do with the sacrificial part of the Yule ceremony. In fact, he didn't want to be part of the Yule ceremony at all, and it being there just made him deeply uncomfortable. The farmers then offered Hakon some of the horse meat that they had sacrificed, which he refused. They then offered him the broth, which he refused. Getting frustrated, they then offered him the drippings from the horse meat that they had cooked, which he refused. You see, in Hakon's eyes, he was being tested by God by these awful pagan traditions. To the farmers' eyes, their king was refusing an ancient custom. Both sides were getting more and more deeply offended, and tensions were starting to rise. However, a local pagan jarl called Sigurd stepped in to try and find a compromise between the farmers and the king. Sigurd had provided much of the food for the feast and had every right to be as equally offended as everyone else. However, he came up with a compromise. Hakon could simply gape his mouth over the kettle where the smoke had settled from the meat. However, this pleased absolutely no one. In fact, King Hakon actually placed a linen cloth over the handle to add another degree of separation from him and the pagan practice. This story highlights how sacred towards the Norse pagan faith this meat was, because Hakon refused to even touch the smoke on the handle that came from the meat. He considered it a sin. Sigurd's kind nature in the saga of Hakon the Great is also a testament to how Yule was about the community coming together and celebrating the year. Sigurd in the saga of King Hakon the Good was said to be open-handed with his charitable donations to the celebrations, as well as giving gifts, and he would also defray the temple. Not sure what that last bit means. Not gonna lie. As you can probably tell, from the fact that these are lit up much better because they've got new batteries in them, this is another day of filming, because it turns out when you try and film for 4 hours straight, your voice and throat start to burn. Much like Christmas, you weren't meant to work over Yule, and this was taken less or more seriously depending on where and when you were celebrating. Yeah, that's the issue with Yule, is trying to pinpoint parts of it, because the amount of stuff we've gone over that may have been true for certain groups, but wasn't true for others, or may have been true at a certain time, but wasn't true at a different time. Like, there's a lot of history. It's the similar issue I had with Saturnalia, figuring out what happened when, although we did have a sort of base idea of what happened on Saturnalia. Whereas with Yule, we really don't have that. As I've reinforced that enough at this point. According to some Germanic sources, the goddess Berchta would come and visit to see if you were working over Yule, and if you were, she would punish you. And if it means a German woman's going to come and punish me, I am most certainly working over Yule. Although I could actually see that being quite harsh on families who had to work over the holiday in order to make ends meet. I mean, it would be like fining poor people today just because they couldn't afford an expensive electric car. In the Icelandic Svasvalda saga... I'm sorry, Iceland. There's a warrior who is depicted as postponing a fight until after the Yuletide. However, even with all the tension and the pushback, Hakon's laws would eventually succeed and people began converting to Christianity. Sadly, Hakon would pass away in a battle and paganism would make a brief resurgence in Norway. However, the measures he had put in place ensured that the resurgence didn't last long, and ultimately the terms of Yule and Christmas would become synonymous with one another. This would transcend Norway. In fact, it would transcend Scandinavia as a whole. Many of the places that at one point celebrated Yule and were now celebrating Christmas, or would come to celebrate Christmas in the future, would end up using the terms of Yule and Christmas synonymously. This is a big factor in why we now say Happy Yuletide, even though technically Christmastide would be more accurate. This is just more evidence that the Christians didn't steal Yule. The two holidays just merged into one. In the account of King Olaf Tryggvason, the King of Norway from 995 to 1000 CE/AD, it tells of how he continued the Christianisation of Norway. He first raised churches on his own estates, and he abolished pagan feasts and sacrifices, in place of which, as a favour to the people, he ordained the holiday feasts of Yule and Easter, St John's Mass Ale, and an Autumn Ale and Michaelmas. Side note, Aidan Mattis of the Law Lodge has already tackled how Easter isn't pagan. I know he's done it on a live stream. I can't remember if he's done a specific video on it. If he has, then that will be clickable here somewhere. It probably won't be clickable because I'll probably forget to put the clickable bit in, but there'll be a thumbnail image, hopefully. And hopefully a link in description if I remember. This brings us to Wassailing. Wassail translates to good health, and it loosely translates to our modern phrase of I drink to your good health. Wassail also doubled as the name of an alcoholic punch that was made of spices and fruit juice and would be used to make a toast. In fact, the word toast actually comes from the toasted bread that would be served alongside the drink. If the drink instead contained egg, milk or cream, it was instead called a nog. After boozing themselves up, the drunken revellers would go a wassailing, which is basically the Yule version of trick-or-treating, but for adults. They would move from house to house demanding treats such as the aforementioned wassail and some sweet foods such as figgy pudding. Yes, they would literally ask you to bring out your figgy pudding. Of course, wassailing would become a medieval tradition, but it may have had its roots in a ritual to bless orchards in the winter before the arrival of Christianity. You see, at the time it was believed that the fruit trees would go into hibernation during the winter as the nights grew longer and longer. To counteract this, groups of people would assemble and make as much noise as humanly possible to wake the trees up during the winter. This one does sound a bit far-fetched to me, but the visualisation of some Germanic tribesmen just screeching to stop Treebeard from having a winter nap is hilarious to me. One of the chants allegedly yelled at the apple trees was, "Let every man take off his hat and shout out, 'Fouled apple tree, old apple tree, we wassail fee, and hoping foul will bear.'" This would eventually evolve into the tradition of wassailing, which as the medieval period went on would basically just become people drunkenly singing in the street, and this would also carry on into the Victorian era with a more modern version of wassailing. Now this tradition does kind of continue with today's youths. You see, they'll come out of nightclubs on Christmas Eve, or more accurately Christmas morning, crawl into bed and then desperately hope that their nan doesn't realise they have a horrific hangover the next day during Christmas dinner. Although she has already noticed, to be fair, but she was disappointed in you long before that, because you could have been a powerful woman in STEM, having men swallow their pride, but instead, the only person swallowing is you. On the flip side of this, you had a different evolution of wassailing, one a lot more upper class and a lot more Victorian. This, of course, was carol singing. Or is carol singing, because it's still done today. Carol singers, much like the original wassailers, although hopefully a lot less drunk, will go door to door asking for charity, food or drink, kind of like far less annoying Jehovah's Witnesses. In Scandinavian cultures, bundles of grain would be crafted into Yule bok, or Yule goats, and in some parts of Scandinavia this is still done today. This may be because 4 is possibly linked to Yule, you know, the god of war and fertility. I checked that last bit on the website for the National Museum of Denmark. It's on there. It is said that 4 rode a chariot pulled by 2 goat bucks, and depending on the story, these goats would either bring gifts to children or would demand gifts on behalf of the Norse god. However, there is a very strong however to this that we'll get to a bit later. The names of these goats were Tanskranir, meaning thin teeth, or the one that has gaps between the teeth. The other goat was called Tansgundroster, meaning teeth grinder, or the one that grinds teeth. And here's that however. You see, there isn't that much evidence to suggest that 4 was directly involved with Yule, and this could just be more modern conjecture. Which brings me to my next point. We don't know for sure where the Yule bok comes from. It may have been an offering at the end of a harvest, similar to corn dollies. There is another tradition, such as a young man dressed as a goat for Yuletide, and this may link back to an ancient pagan fertility festival, but it may also just as easily link back to the 2 goats pulling 4's chariot. Over time, the Yule bok became the Yule Tomte, which is essentially just a merging of the Yule goat and Santa Claus. Yule Tomte delivers presents to children in a sleigh pulled by a reindeer. This is very similar to our Santa Claus or Father Christmas, because, as I just said, the Yule Tomte is essentially our Santa Claus merged with the Yule book, although modern depictions of Yule Tomte actually depict him alongside the Yule bok as his sort of companion, which is very different to what the Alpine regions went with for Santa Claus's companion. As Christianity took hold in Scandinavia, the Yule goat also took on the form of an invisible spirit that would visit each house just before Christmas to ensure that Christmas preparations were being done properly. As we've already covered, there was very much a spiritual nature to Yule, and people, particularly the Norse, would gather around bonfires and the hearth and discuss stories of visitations from spirits and other otherworldly beings hidden just beyond the firelight. Now, this probably sounds somewhat familiar to you, and that's because even if you're not telling ghost stories around a campfire or around a hearth, because most of us don't have hearths anymore, you're still partaking in this ancient tradition. How, you ask? How many of you are going to be watching A Christmas Carol this year, or have watched A Christmas Carol? Because Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol is literally telling a ghost story at Christmas. Also, I want to very quickly add that The Muppets Christmas Carol is the definitive version of A Christmas Carol, and Disney re-add the love we lost, because the love we found at the end of the Poxy film makes no sense without it. I can handle one sad scene in your Muppet film. The Grettis Saga described Yule as a time of greatest mirth and joy among men. And with that, we move on to our next segment, how Yule became Christmas. As Christianity spread out of the Middle East and spent a lot of time being eaten by lions and tortured by Romans, although the candle thing probably wasn't true, the Christians would eventually take control of the Roman Empire. They managed this because of St. Constantine the Great, my favourite Roman emperor, and I covered how this happened on my collaborative video on the successor of the Roman emperor, which I really recommend. It's technically not me plugging myself because I collaborated with other people to do it, so loopholes. Being born into the Roman Empire, Christianity inherited one of their tactics. They would find similarities between them and other cultures and them and other religions, and then use these similarities to integrate them into their society. The Christians called this Interpretatio Christiania, meaning the Christian interpretation. Christian missionaries would go into a society, learn about their culture, their history, and most importantly, their religion, find the similarities and use that to bridge the gap, finding commonality, and then slowly begin converting the populace. One of the ways this was done was literally just Christian missionaries going around and saying, hey look, you're already doing this, so you may as well do it in the name of our God and make sure that you get into heaven. This tactic was incredibly successful. It's one of the major reasons that Saturnalia just naturally evolved into Christmas. I mean, imagine this. A guy comes up to you and says, hey, keep doing what you're doing. You don't need to change anything. Just do it in the name of my God instead, and you'll avoid eternal damnation. I mean, I'd make that deal. You'd make that deal. It's a damn good deal. Of course, it was around the 9th century that Yule and Christmas began to be used synonymously. In fact, this is mostly still true around the English-speaking world, although you're more likely to have heard the term Yuletide than Christmastide. You're also likely to hear Yule amongst Scots speakers. In Norwegian, Swedish and Danish, you're likely to hear Yule. In Estonian, you're likely to hear Jullud. In Finnish, you're likely to hear Jullo. And in Icelandic, you'll probably hear Jol. Now, as we covered in the last segment, evergreen decorations were used in both Yule and Saturnalia. However, church records from the late Middle Ages show entries for the purchase of holly and ivy for the winter. To the Christians celebrating Christmas, evergreens represented eternal life and the promise of the return of life in the spring. It wasn't just churches that utilised evergreens in decorations, and private homes would have done so as well. And they still do. An account from 1444 was discovered by 16th century London historian John Stowe, and explained that in London, every man's house and also his parish church was decked with holm, ivy, bays, and whatever the season of the year afforded to be green. The famous Christmas carol Deck the Halls with Boughs of Holly originated from Wales during the 16th century, showing for just how long holly has been a staple Christmas tradition. During the Victorian period, holly and fir garlands would be strewn into the mantelpiece. In fact, in 1877, Charles Darwin would write from his home at Down House that he was worried that the scarcity of bees in the spring had resulted in fewer berries on holly that winter. We cannot decorate our Christmas hearths with the scarlet berries of holly because bees were rare during the spring. Now to discuss perhaps the most famous evergreen, the one that most of us have a plastic version of, the Christmas tree. In the previous section we discussed the possible origin for the Christmas tree. However, the modern Christmas tree itself was a German tradition that was brought to the British Isles by German royalty. Now it's often Queen Victoria's consort Prince Albert that's credited for bringing over the Christmas tree in 1840. However, it was actually the good Queen Charlotte, the German wife of King George III, who will be getting her own video at some point. Which will be spicy. Queen Charlotte set up the first known Christmas tree on the British Isles at Queen's Lodge in Windsor. Christmas trees would then become incredibly popular amongst the upper classes. I wonder if they had any Christmas trees on the island. Anyways, this would mean that evergreens would sometimes be uprooted just for the purpose of, well, Christmas. By the way, after that Epstein joke, I would like to just quickly add, I like living and I have no suicidal intentions or thoughts. I also don't have the ability to shoot myself in the back with a shotgun while hanging myself. Anyway, these Christmas trees were usually candlelit and decorated with trinkets whilst surrounded by piles of presents. Over time, the Yule traditions would warp and wassailing, particularly medieval practice, would become a true spectacle. On the 12th night of Christmas, the 5th of January, people would take to the streets in various outlandish outfits and costumes to sing and dance. In some places, however, the ancient Yule tradition still hold strong. In places like Iceland, Norway, Denmark and Sweden, wassailing can still be heard, and of course, you'll see the odd Yule goat or two. In Wales, there is actually a tradition similar to the wassailing of old. This is called the Merry Lwyd. Now, this could be a video all of its own, so I'll briefly try to summarise here. The Merry Lwyd is a horse skull attached to a pole, often with baubles for eyes and colourful streamers of holly and ivy for a mane. A large white cloak hides the operator, who opens and closes the skull's mouth so it can speak. Often travelling at the head of a procession, the Merry Lwyd, or the Grey Mare, will travel house to house in order to have a rhyming poetry battle with you. If you win, the Merry Lwyd will leave. If you lose, the Merry Lwyd will come in alongside everyone that was travelling with it. The origins for the Merry Lwyd aren't exactly known, and it may actually come from the medieval English tradition of wassailing, or it may come from even earlier Anglo-Saxon or even Scandinavian traditions. Much like the various Germanic groups we've looked at, the Brittonic Celts or the modern-day Welsh would celebrate New Year on or around the winter solstice. In comparison, the Gaels or the modern Irish saw the end of the year at the start of the winter or the end of the harvest. However, both groups seem to participate in the tradition of the killing of the wren or the hunting of the wren. This tradition saw young boys or occasionally younger men carrying a wren who had passed away through the local streets, leading a procession. The wren would sometimes be carried by hand or in a box, whilst people would give the young boys treats in order to see the wren. This may link back to an ancient Celtic pagan custom where the wren symbolises the old year or the winter season. The wren was also one of two important birds used for divination, the other being the raven. For medieval Gaels, the raven was linked to wealth and luck, and the wren was linked to ill fortune and the winter. In Welsh mythology, however, Llw smacks a wren, which earns him the name Llw Havis, or the fair-haired one with the skilled hand. Now for the bit that will almost certainly upset some people. You see, we all know the origin story for Santa Claus, and most of us don't know the full story of St. Nicholas, who deserves a video all of his own, and we will get to that. However, me bringing Santa up specifically in a video specifically on Yule means only one thing. There may be a slightly ancient pagan side to Santa Claus. Now, the historical origin for Santa Claus is St. Nicholas. This is a fact. It is also a fact that this makes Santa Claus Christian. However, the modern image of Santa Claus. In the 18th and 19th centuries, German and Scandinavian immigrants would come to America, bringing with them their unique version of Santa Claus. This would evolve into the version that we know and love today. Artists such as Jenny Nystrom would create the joyous image, and then Coca-Cola would finish the job. To be honest, I could probably do an entire Christmas special just on the evolution of the image of Santa Claus. Essentially, there is a chance that the modern image of Santa Claus, with the big red rosy cheeks, the big beard, the big red coat, the jolly exterior, may come from Odin. And to be fair, the connections can't be missed. A massive beard, a deep connection to magic and requiring sacrifices for their service. However, none of this matters anyways, because we can just ask Santa because he's real. How do I know this? Because he called me once to ask me if I'd been a good boy this year, or the year that he phoned me when I was younger. And before you say I finally lost it, I demand you tell me that the governments of the world wouldn't cover up the existence of Santa Claus. I mean, the Americans have Ruby Ridge, Waco, the Move bombing, MK Ultra. The British government had an entire island for anthrax. In fact, at one point, the British owned the quarter of the world. What colour was the British Empire on maps? Red. What colour is Santa Claus? Red. They were covering up the entire existence of Santa Claus and mocking us while they did it. And what reason would specifically the Western governments have for covering up the existence of Santa Claus? Well, I'm glad you asked. You see, Santa Claus wears a big red coat, and he has informants in every household letting him know if we've been naughty or nice. How do I know? Because my mum phoned him up once year to let him know that I wasn't eating broccoli. I like broccoli. It might not have been broccoli, but anyway, he has informants in every house. And lastly, he runs sweatshops. Santa Claus is a communist. Speaking of Santa's elves, they may also originate from Scandinavian folklore. In Swedish and Norwegian folklore, there are spirits called Nissa, similar to the English hobgoblin. These spirits can either help or hinder depending on how they're treated, and in the 19th century, they began gradually being linked more and more with Christmas, making gifts for people alongside the Yule goat. Food would be left out for them, similar to how we leave out food for Santa and his reindeer today, and also similar to how they used to leave out food for spirits and gods during Yule, as we explored earlier. Mistletoe, that cute little Christmas tradition where the city girl who spent her entire life focusing on her career and barely sees her family anymore and barely spends any time with her fiancé, gets a sudden work trip back to her old town where all of a sudden she meets this hunky lumberjack / baker / adoptive father / widower / dog whisperer, and then snogs him under the mistletoe whilst the Hallmark movie desperately tries to make the fiancé look so evil they have to stop short of him being Ted Bundy to make their protagonist look moderately likeable. Also, spoiler alert for every single Hallmark Christmas movie, the old man and the old woman who run the bakery at the centre of town are actually Mr. and Mrs. Claus, and they'll fly off into the night at the end of the movie using horrific CGI. Now back to the topic at hand. You see, mistletoe was quite important to certain druid groups and the Norse pagans. Both groups believed that mistletoe had magical properties, as it would stay green even when the tree it was attached to had dropped its leaves for the winter, or in rare cases when the tree had passed away over winter, almost as if another plant was sucking out its life force. Now, mistletoe can be found on various trees, but for the purpose of its religious importance here, it was found on apple and oak trees. If it was found on a sacred oak tree, it would be cut down during a special ceremony using a golden sickle, where it would fall down onto a white cloak before it could touch the ground. The mistletoe would then be shared with every home in the village, and this was to protect over any evil during the coming year, and this would eventually become a New Year's tradition. Now, according to some sources, the tradition of kissing under mistletoe comes from the story of Balder. No, not that Balder. Like so many other stories and figures we've covered in this video, Balder deserves his own video, but in the interest of time, I'll give you the abridged version of the story now. His mother Frigg was troubled by bad dreams of his passing, so she went to a seeress in the afterlife who told her that Balder was destined to pass soon. To protect her son, Frigg travelled all the 9 realms to ensure that all things would swear an oath to not hurt Balder. The other gods then saw it as a fun game to throw things at Balder. Loki, not the Disney reject, the actual trickster god Loki, saw this and disguised himself as a female traveller, asking Frigg if it's true all things promised never to harm Balder. Frigg innocently replied she had never asked mistletoe because it was so young and innocent that it couldn't hurt anyone. In the business, we call this foreshadowing. Loki then immediately found some mistletoe and gave it to Balder's blind brother, Hod, who threw it at him. When Hod threw the mistletoe, it obviously unalived Balder. It's said that Frigg decreed people should kiss under mistletoe to ensure it would never again be used as a weapon. In other stories, Frigg's tears as she cries for her son turned the berries of the mistletoe from red to white, ensuring the eventual return of Balder. Some versions of the story of Balder have Frigg casting spells of protection against all the plants of the earth, failing to do so against mistletoe as it grows from a tree branch rather than from the earth. Hearing this, Loki creates a spear out of mistletoe. There is, however, a glaring issue as to how the story of Balder became, one, the reason we kiss under mistletoe, and two, how mistletoe became so important to both Yule and Christmas in the first place. Especially Christmas. Historian Mark Forthwith, author of A Christmas Cornucopia, The Hidden Stories Behind Our Yuletide Traditions, claims the tradition of kissing under the mistletoe began around the years 1720 and 1784 in England. Kissing under the mistletoe wouldn't have existed as a popular tradition before 1720 because the most extensive research about the plant was published that year and it did not reference the practice. In 1719 and 1720, English apothecary and physician John Colebatch would write 2 separate books on mistletoe, having an entire section dedicated to superstitions. However, kissing under the mistletoe was never once mentioned. The earliest reference Forthwith was able to find comes from the comic opera 2 for 1 in 1784. When at Christmas in the hall the men and maids are hopping, if by chance I hear 'em bawl, amongst 'em quick I pop in. When all the men, Jem, John and Joe, cry, "What good luck has sent ye?" and kiss beneath the mistletoe, the girl's not turned yet 20. Kinda worried about the age of the girl that all the men seem to be trying to snog under the mistletoe. Why specify that she's not even turned 20? Something with a similar tradition to the modern mistletoe was kissing bows. Kissing bows were Christmas decorations of 2 or 4 crossed hoops that would form a spherical shape. This would then be decorated with whatever greenery was available, and the bows could measure up to 1.5 meters tall. They were often placed along walls or above doorways as a gesture of goodwill welcoming guests into the home. No one really knows when kissing bows made their way to England, but we do know they were popular with the Tudors, and by the time of the Georgians, they were decorated with apples, oranges and other greeneries. According to tradition, a gentleman would pluck a berry from the kissing bow and give it to a lady, who would then kiss him on the cheek until there were no berries left and no more kisses could be given. This is most likely where our modern mistletoe tradition comes from, although we aren't 100% sure. However, mistletoe was still involved with Christmas. In fact, the poet Robert Herwick is the first known source to associate mistletoe with Christmas in his poem Ceremony upon Candlemas Eve. Down with the rosemary and bays, down with the mistletoe. Instead of holly, now upraised the greener box for show. The holly hitherto did sway, let the box now domineer, until the dancing Easter day or Easter's Eve appear. Then youthful box, which now hath grace your houses to renew, grown old surrender must his place unto the crisped yew. When yew is out, the birch comes in, and many flowers beside, both of a fresh and fragrant kin, to honour Whitsuntide. Green rushes then, and sweetish bents, and with cooler oaken boughs, come in for comely ornaments to readorn the house. Thus times do shift, each thing his turn does hold, new things succeed as former things grow old. Now, Yule was a pagan celebration, and most of its traditions did end up merging with Christmas. However, being a pagan celebration, it was obviously stamped out by Christianity eventually. Now, as the world began turning its back on organised religion, particularly the Western world, in the early 2000s you saw the growth of a massive atheist movement. However, we all know what happened to the Amazing Atheist. And as time progressed, the former members of r/atheism looked for new and interesting ways to hate Christianity. My source for this? I was in these circles as a child. This saw an uptick in people following a repackaged Satanism, which simply is not Satanism. I have had close encounters with actual Satanists, and believe me, the modern Church of Satan is not proper Satanism. It's just some edgy atheist larpers. Anyways, this also saw the resurgence of neo-pagan movements such as Wicca, which we'll tackle in another video, and Norse revivalists. There was also a few Celtic pagan and Slavic pagan movements that sprung up, but I'm just mentioning them before someone goes, "You forgot this movement!" With these movements came a resurgence in the celebration of Yule and the winter solstice. However, they're celebrated very differently to how the original celebrations were celebrated. Said celebration a lot there. According to some neo-pagans, it's at this time of year when the Holly King, who controls the dark half of the year, gives way to the Sun God, or the Oak King, who controls the light half of the year. Now, the idea of two gods battling it out throughout the year to represent the changing of the seasons is actually present in a lot of folklore, mythology, and various pagan religions. In fact, in the last video we did on the Lwyd, we covered the Mithra of the Sea and Tiran, who battle it out over the Orkney Islands. And yes, I am managing to plug another of my videos once again. I'm not even sorry. Today, many pagans celebrate Yule between the 20th of December and the 31st of December, and in this time they may withdraw from an online presence to focus on spending time with friends and family. Today, the modern followers of Wassail believe that the gods, as well as the spirits of the earth and the ancestors, join us for the celebrations at this time of year. For modern pagans, the altar on Yule should face north, and the area is decorated with holly and mistletoe, as well as dried leaves and fruit, such as hops and haw. A chalice of appropriate wine, mead or cider, the oak or pine log with up to 13 green, white and red candles, decorated with carvings, runes or symbols, is placed centrally on the altar. The appropriate fragranced incense burning and scenting the air, e.g. bay, juniper, cedar, pine or rosemary, is pretty good for this. As you can tell, I really want to get this video done. So we're just going for it. The main issue with trying to recreate Yule in the 21st century is, unlike Saturnalia, where we do have written records written by the people who were celebrating it at the time, we don't have them for Yule, as I've said many times in this video. And the ones we do have written after the fact by people whose best interest it was to make Yule look bad. On top of that, the information we do have of Yule is spread over such a vast time period and over many cultures that to recreate an authentic Yule is nigh on impossible. So the modern version of Yule is very much pieced together. And again, the modern version of Yule is split over various different religious groups and various different cultural groups. So, even then, there's multiple different versions of a modern Yule. Now, I've covered which Yule traditions I think weren't actually Yule traditions. And I think there is still a lot of truth in the information we have. It's just either exaggerated or didn't quite happen how it's written down. I mean, we have a lot of Yule traditions in Christmas that we know did come from Yule. So we have the evolved form. We have not the final form, because there's people in the future that will probably be celebrating something completely different. Maybe the French will invent a new Christmas dessert. But we do have some semblance of Yule still in Christmas. So, did the Christians steal Yule? No. Did the Christians move Jesus' birthday to make it easier to convert the pagans? Also no. Did the Christians move Yule to make it easier to convert the pagans? Yes. Did Yule and Christmas merge into one holiday after being in close proximity, as different cultures would meet via trade and warfare and obviously religious conversion? Yes! The idea that the Christians turned up and converted the pagan population by stealing pagan beliefs and traditions makes no sense. And if you want to be mad about the Christians stamping out paganism, get mad about the Northern Crusades, where the Christians, at the end of a sword, forced pagans to convert. The Northern Crusade is where you get mad. Not the fact that two holidays merged into one. Because Christmas, at its core, is still Christian. It just does contain some pagan traditions that were pulled in by people who were formerly pagan and then converted to Christianity. Christmas is quite literally a tapestry of history, from the Roman pagans celebrating Saturnalia to Northern and Western Europeans celebrating Yule or the winter solstice. Modern Christmas is a hodgepodge of different cultures and religions and belief spread out across centuries. To act like it was stolen denies entire swaths of history. So my verdict of did the Christians steal Yule? Absolutely not. So my final verdict is we still kind of celebrate Saturnalia, we still kind of celebrate Yule, and we still kind of celebrate Christmas. And the reason I say that last part is how many people will be working Christmas Day? How many people will be going to church? Modern Christmas is also a hodgepodge from celebrations around the world. It takes a couple of influences from Diwali, a couple of influences from Hanukkah. Actually, we're not going to go too deep into that before I end up making 4 more videos of these for the next 4 years every Christmas on celebrations the Christians didn't sell. We're so close to the end now, I'm going to ignore the fact I misspoke there. But yeah, if anything, Yule hijacked Christmas. If anything, the Christians didn't steal Yule. The pagans stole Christmas. I suppose there's a reason the Grinch is green. And anyways, with that, let me know in the comments down below if I got anything wrong, if I missed anything, what you would like to see in the next video. I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.